I think the overarching theme is that coaches who think they know a lot are more likely to do harm than good, the higher the level of the athlete.
Hey, this is More Than Velocity. I'm Bart Pear, and today we've got a special that I think everybody's really going to like. Along with Jordan Oseguera and Ryan Croton, who are always here, we've got Ben Brewster with Tread Athletics. Really excited to talk to Ben today. He's got a lot of unique perspective that we don't typically see with facilities out there developing baseball players, and I think it's going to turn into a pretty good conversation. So, Ben, first of all, glad you're here. Why don't you quickly explain what Tread Athletic is and how you're kind of different than the average facility out there?
Yeah, so thanks for having me, Bart. Good to be here. I've followed some of your guys' content for the past several months since you started the YouTube channel. So anybody who is watching this obviously already follows you guys. But again, some of the highest quality information out there, and definitely deserve more subscribers than you guys have at this point. So I want to do my part just to help kind of grow the channel, because there aren't that many channels out there that really put out, research-backed, evidence-based information from people who have worked, within the highest levels of baseball. So I appreciate what you guys are doing, first off. For those of you who aren't familiar with Tread Athletics or watching, so I played professionally myself. I kind of had my story in a nutshell. Basically, I was terrible in high school. I threw 70 miles an hour as a freshman in high school. I weighed 150 pounds at 6'3". I just decided one day, after a terrible freshman season at my high school, I'm going to do whatever it takes to play at the highest level. And for me, I was a little naive at the time. I was like, I'm going to throw 95 miles an hour and I'm going to get drafted. Like, that was my goal. I threw 70 miles an hour. I was terrible. So at that point, it was a little bit naive. Like, if a random kid came up to me today and told me that, I'd say, we have a long way to go. Let's take it one step at a time. But that was my goal. I just dove in. I started reading everything I could, learning everything. There was a lot less information out there 12 to 15 years ago than there is now. It was Paul Nyman, Set Pro, for those of you who are kind of familiar and remember that world. It was letstalkpitching.com. There was pretty much one forum out there where you could learn about pitching information. It was, Dick Mills and Mike Marshall. There were a few names, but nothing like today. There was no concept of weighted balls. People didn't even realize that velocity could be trained. There was really very limited information out there. And so I was reading and learning everything I possibly could. Cut to the chase, went through high school, injured myself a million times, just trying everything you can possibly imagine, lifting improperly, just following every free program out there, trying to gain weight, failing, anything you can imagine. I was trying to put all the pieces together. And that kind of becomes a theme with Tread, is there's so many pieces that go into performance. And I was just sitting there scrambling, just trying to learn, kid by myself. My high school wasn't great at baseball. We didn't have a coach who really cared. We didn't have any sort of development. It was me in the weight room by myself, trying to figure out how to get better, reading 4 hours a night. And so I ended up throwing mid 80s as a high school senior. I'm a funky lefty. So, at least I had that going for me, but I ended up walking on at University of Maryland. For some reason, Eric Bakich, he's the coach of Michigan now, saw something at the walk-on tryout. He gave me a spot on the team. Instantly, I was the worst player on the team. Everybody else threw upper 80s, low 90s, or low to mid 90s. I threw mid 80s. So again, I was in this process of trying to figure out, why did I suck? What was wrong with my mechanics? Why couldn't I gain weight? Why was I still weak? All these sorts of different things. And I was trying to balance all this at once. Long story short, I kind of fought and clawed my way up through 95 as a senior sign, drafted by the White Sox. And in that first pro season, I'd basically been keeping a log of my progress online for this whole process. Since 15 years old, I was every single week keeping a log. And this is still out there today. It's a public pitching log on this forum, Let's Talk Pitching. And a number of dads and players and, thousands of people had followed this log and followed this evolution. So people started to reach out after I got drafted saying, hey, could you write a program for my son? Hey, could you take a look at my son's mechanics? Hey, I'm a college pitcher. I'd love some information. I'd love some advice and feedback. So I was I had no intention of starting a remote training company. I had no intention of getting into coaching at that point. I did study kinesiology as my undergrad, just because it's hey, if I can learn any little shred of information through that major that might help with my baseball career, I'm going to do that. So that's why I did it, but I wasn't trying to get into coaching. But it just became one of those things where there was clearly a demand there. I was in season. in my first pro season. I was trying to figure out how to help these kids, make a little bit of extra income on the side. Obviously, you're making $4 an hour in the minor leagues. But realizing like, hey, there actually is an opportunity to help these kids. It's not like, you're just going to give them a 5-minute mechanical breakdown and send them on their way. Like there actually is an opportunity. They have nothing in their area. They have no idea really what to do to get better. They're just being given towel drills and, doing half squats and deadlifts with rounded backs, and don't understand how to track their calories, and don't understand they have 17 different mobility issues. And so all this stuff that I had learned and applied in my own career, I started to realize like, look, I can put this into a system. I can put this into a systemized, assessment process. We can build out the lifting component, the mobility component, the nutrition component. Like we can put all these different pieces together, the throwing component, and really make an impact on these guys' careers, because they're all just, they're going to a strength coach, but the strength coach doesn't understand baseball. And maybe they go to a nutritionist, but the nutritionist doesn't understand throwing mechanics. And maybe they have a pitching coach, but the pitching coach doesn't understand strength training. And so as we talked about right before this, we hit record, there's this siloed approach in baseball at every level where no one really can take this bird's eye view and look at development from that bird's eye view, where you can see all the different pieces that go into high performance and how they all interact. And so that's what I wanted to do. And that's how Tread was initially founded. It was founded to help some of these athletes get better, but trying to figure out a way to actually get them better and not just, sell a one-time assessment or a one-time service that really doesn't get them better. And so the process for Tread has been, hey, we want to basically be mentors that can address all the different pieces of their development from a bird's eye view and be with them for the duration of their entire careers. So we genuinely approach every athlete that comes to Tread as a remote training service, as we want to be with you for the rest of your career. And so we've had athletes now, we've been in business for 6 years, that have been with us for 6 years, where it's like, we are going to be there. We're going to help you navigate all of the different variables that go into high school, and navigate all the variables that go into college, and navigate all the variables, if you make it to pro baseball, that go into that. And how do we balance all these things? Because there's all these very intimate inner reactions between, you can't divorce like your nutrition program from your throwing program, from how you adapt to your strength program. If you go and squat 10 sets of 10, that's going to affect your bullpen the next day. If you don't get adequate sleep or you don't eat enough calories, that's going to affect your bullpen the next day. If you throw 150 pitches in your outing, that's going to affect your ability to deadlift or your upper body lift the next day. So these things all interrelate. And so that's really how Tread was founded. It started with my co-founder, Cohen, and I starting it that first year. And from there, it's really just been something that we're passionate about. We've both just really been passionate about helping pitchers. It began with, 30 athletes. Actually, Rob Friedman, Pitching Ninja, his son was one of our very first clients. He had been following that log for like 7 years, and he was one of our very first clients. His issue, and again, this takes understanding all the different pieces. His son's issue was nutrition, and he had been to some of these different facilities around the country. He's a 14-year-old kid throwing 76. His issue was actually nutrition, and no one had actually sat down and taken a look at the big picture and realized, like, well, it's not mechanics. He moves really well. He was throwing 76 at 130 pounds, 135 pounds at 14. He moved really well, really strong for his size, right? He was trap bar deadlifting 375 at 130 pounds. That's pretty strong for his size. No one had actually sat him down and explained to him the importance of nutrition and actually given him an actionable step-by-step process for implementing that advice. No one had explained, here's how we take all this noise about insulin and all this stuff. And like, no, calories, macronutrients, here's how you track it. It takes 2 minutes after each meal. Here are the best carb, protein, fat sources. Here's exactly how you do it. Here's the pitfalls you're going to find. Here's exactly what to do when those happen. And I'm here every step of the way to answer your questions if you get off track. Here's how to track your body weight. We're going to get a live feed every single week of where your body weight's at and if you're on track. Boom. He did it for a week, gained 1.5 pounds, another week, gained another 1.5 pounds. And he's like, I got it. I understand this. And from there, it's like, let's just keep doing that. We track all the metrics. We make sure everything's on track. He gained 70 pounds in a year and a half. And he was throwing 95 as a high school senior, 91 as a junior. And so for him, like, we have countless guys where nutrition was a limiting factor and countless guys where it was something else. So maybe it's a subtle mechanical flaw. Maybe it was a strength flaw. I know we're going to talk a little bit about that in the podcast, but understanding like everybody has a different limiting factor, and you can't truly appreciate and understand that unless you can look at it from the bird's eye view. check the box. Are they doing everything from a nutrition standpoint? You need to. Are they doing everything from a mobility standpoint? Did you actually assess them head to toe and see where their deficiencies are? Do you actually know how to address the joint of the tissue or strengthen that specific position where they're lacking? Right? Is their strength where it needs to be head to toe? On one leg, on two legs, pushing, pulling, grip, isometric strength, concentric strength, power. Have you addressed those variables? And so there's so much going on. And I was the guy who was just trying to figure it all out. And there's all this noise. And I probably cost myself 4 years of development trying to do it myself. That now I look back and I'm like, wow, that was an amazing learning experience. But I really wish I had thrown 95 as a senior in high school and not as a senior in college. And so that was ultimately the motivation to starting Tread. It's not having people make the same mistakes I made. And, I'm going on my 4th surgery actually next week. And I've probably had 100 injuries over the course of my 15-year career. And a lot of those could have been prevented through smart training, through, understanding proper form, through eating properly, through recovering properly, through understanding proper biomechanics and, not listening to random gurus online that would say certain mechanical cues that made no sense. So yeah, just a lot of failure that's kind of fueled trying to learn, fueled improving, and then trying to share that with other athletes. So anyway, to finish that up, just some context. We now coach over 900 athletes as a company. We have 27 employees. And so we're growing this thing into a monster. We're trying to really scale impact. That's our mission. Our mission is to help athletes rewrite their stories. And to do that, we need to understand so much information on the back end and be able to simplify and distill that down. And so we're just trying to give guys a chance to achieve what they're capable of. For a 15-year-old who's throwing 60, maybe his dream is to play D2 college baseball. Let's do it. For a pro guy who's just on the cusp, it's to play in the big leagues. Let's do it. We have big leaguers where they're just a fringe big leaguer. Their goal is to be a Hall of Famer or be an all-star. Let's do it. So that's our goal at this point. And our goal is just to scale that impact and just as big as we can possibly scale that impact. And beyond just that piece, it's I know you guys are doing something very similar. Can we become a trusted resource in the industry for everyone who isn't our client? For every one person that works with us, 100 people follow us, dads, athletes, they still want to get better. Can we help them? Can we have an impact on them? And so that starts to be really exciting when you think about being able to exponentially scale your impact and, seeing the quality of the content you guys are putting out. I think we're on the same page as far as that too.
Yeah. If you don't mind going a little more in depth, one of the things that stood out when you're talking about those logs, the daily logs, tracking what you're doing on a regular basis, that's something that every athlete I've ever worked with, I've encouraged them. You write down what you did on a day-to-day basis, and you're going to find out what is working and what isn't working. So you can pivot really quick. If you don't mind going into a little more depth on that, because I think that's something that's very overlooked in development.
So I don't know if I have screen sharing privileges here. If you can enable that, I can actually show you what the logs look like. If you want to do that. But basically the idea is we need to be able to track the inputs and the outputs. We need to be able to track what are you doing from a throwing, nutrition, training standpoint, and then how is your body actually responding to that? Mm-hmm. Similar to what you guys have been kind of talking about with the app. But, okay, we took in 3,600 calories on average this week. Well, we lost a pound. Okay, that's not working. We're trying to gain 20 pounds in 6 months. Okay, let's bump it up to 4,000. Did you actually follow that? Yes. Okay, we gained half a pound. Cool. You need to know the input and the output to see how your body's actually responding to that stressor, to that variable.
Yeah, one thing I want to touch on that as well is just the importance of the honesty of putting that stuff in. Because I have some players that I work with that are really struggling to gain weight, and they think it's going to make me happy to see that they wrote down 5,500 calories for the amount of food they ate. It's I would rather you just be honest with me that you may have prepared 5,500 calories of food, but if you only ate 2,500, we need to know why you're just staying the same all the time. So the honesty, and it's going to give you that introspection, I think is the word, to really know what's going on with that athlete to create those plans.
For sure. And we tell them up front, look, if you're just lying to yourself, if you're going to put in false numbers, if you're going to tell me you squat 400 pounds and you weigh 130 pounds, you're just lying to yourself. We'll have athletes like that where they come in and it's some high school kid who's 160 pounds and he says these crazy strength. He's I row 120 pound dumbbells for 5. I'm no, you don't. I don't even have to look. I don't even have to look at you to realize you don't do that. So this is just an example. So we try to keep it, again, as simple as possible. There's so much noise when it comes to nutrition. If they get calories and macronutrients right, that takes care of 99% of nutrition. And I'm sure a dietitian who's like dealing with very specific scenarios and micronutrient ratios and everything would disagree. But from a purely body composition standpoint, if you're trying to have a kid gain weight to support getting stronger, you need the calories and the macronutrients. So we have our guys track fat, carb, protein intake. We give them specific goals. We'll use MyFitnessPal typically for them to track that. It's the easiest way that we found. Literally just at the end of each meal, take 2 minutes and input what they ate and input the portions. At the end of the day, they can see if they hit their goal or not. And we give them a specific goal for each of that. And then they just weigh themselves once a day and write it in. So it'll, track along the trend line that we've given them. They can see very quickly, are they on track? Are they not? Right? If they're just not following it and their weight is down here, super easy as the coach to see that, super easy as the athlete to see you're getting off track. Why are you getting off track? Are you not hitting your calories? Oh, wait, your goal is 4,280 a day. You're eating 3,200 a day on average. Like, we probably need compliance like that. Now that becomes a conversation with the coach. How do we improve compliance? Right? Is it a problem?
I got a quick question for you, man, as you're on this, because I think athletes need to know this too. When do you have them weigh themselves? For instance, like, are they in a hydrated state? Is it in the morning? Is it after they've eaten, for the entire day, and it's at night before they go to bed? I think that would be helpful, for the people who are, out there listening to this to understand what should they be telling these athletes to be consistent?
Yeah. So my preference is first thing in the morning after going to the bathroom. And that accounts for if you were like hyperhydrated going to bed, like after you go to the bathroom, it kind of evens out that state. You don't have food in your stomach and you've gone to the bathroom. That's just a consistent state to measure your body weight in. It doesn't have to be that time, but it should be a consistent state of how fed you are and how hydrated you are every day. So you can do it before bed or first thing in the morning or both. Typically, you're going to find if you do measure both, which is okay, you're going to see a 2 to 4 pound swing between the morning and the nighttime number. And that's okay. You can measure both and just see how they both, increase. But you just have a little more noise if you track the bedtime weight, because if you had a later dinner or like a huge dinner and didn't eat big of a breakfast, like there's just more going on. So first thing in the morning after going to the bathroom is what we use. Do you have a different kind of set of guidelines that you tell your guys, or is that what you guys used to?
I mean, yeah, for me, pro ball, it was a little bit chaotic because you had to measure them when they got to the field. And they were usually coming in hydrated and they're usually coming in fed. But the one thing that we didn't do that I think is essential for young athletes is they need to weigh themselves after games, because they lose a ton of body water. And what people might not know is that water is actually helping muscle growth, because if you're hydrated, your muscle cells are larger. And especially if you're hydrated going into your lift, and then you're taking in your protein, you just have bigger cells to put more amino acids in there. And so whatever weight is lost, they need to gain it back. And we didn't do that. And we didn't do that because of a manpower issue, I think. And we should have put it on the athletes, but we wanted to be there to measure their body weight just so that we had accurate numbers. Right. And so we didn't run the risk of an athlete, making up numbers. But I think that's pretty essential for young athletes to get into the right hydration habit. Because I know we've talked about what you're saying. I completely agree with it, getting the macros right. But if they don't really understand body water, they might use a urine scale or something to that effect to understand, how hydrated they are. They're leaving muscle growth on the table. For sure. When they're not hydrated.
And a big piece of that too, you might be able to touch on this, is carbohydrate intake. Because we know that water binds to the carbohydrates. And so if you are going on a super, super low carb diet, you're inherently going to be less hydrated. You're going to have less water in your muscles. You're going to hold less water. And so I don't know if you want to speak to that, but that's an important piece as well, is just having, we try to get as many carbs as we can in that diet, provided that we've checked the fat and the protein intake boxes. Get it again, especially for guys that are doing, they're in the middle of fall ball, or they're, conditioning once a day and lifting once a day and at practice for 4 hours in like college. Super, super important. A lot of guys don't realize that. They just eat whatever, and they don't realize that carbohydrate intake is extremely important too.
Yeah. I think you need to be hydrated. You need to have obviously water, carbohydrates, and salt. And if they're lacking those areas, I know there was a significant keto athlete who's a catcher. I mean, usually the one year that we had all these catchers, I think it was in 19. We just had catchers that were absolutely ripped. I mean, you've never seen better physical bodies on a catcher than the ones we had. Luke Croy, we had a few of them, but there was one in particular that mentioned that he was on a keto diet. He ate mostly meat, had very, meat, nuts. He had very little carbohydrates. But when we realized that, he didn't play every day, that might have been okay for him. But we had a catching injury where Lucroy got laid out by a base runner, and he had to then start catching every day, and he was exhausted. Our lifts he would come in and lift. He'd be so highly motivated, 40-minute lift, which is a lot in Major League Baseball. You don't want a player in there longer than that. And you could tell that his energy levels weren't there, and the carbohydrates are our fastest energy, and yes, baseball, there's a lot of standing around. You're using a lot of fat, as a fuel source, but you need to have a lot of muscle glycogen. You have to have enough stored carbohydrates, because over the course of games with heat, and dehydration, all these kinds of things, you're going to start using a lot of the body's, sugar. And so, that was a major change. And, when I think about pitchers, starting pitchers, they should be snacking. You should never go 3 hours without eating something, without having a snack that's got, a 4-to-1 ratio, or even, less, but carbohydrates to protein. You need to have that as an energy source. And so one of the things that we really stressed, because we knew that carbohydrates were important in the hydration, and like trail mix, that was great because there was the carbohydrates from dried fruit, quick energy. It also combined with the protein from the nuts, but they were also salty. So, we really wanted to encourage our athletes to have snacks, because like you're saying, like, we don't want them to lose body weight. What people might not know, I'm a research associate at Louisiana Tech, and we're on this big study about elastic resources and particularly jumping capabilities in pitchers. And when we looked at all these particular variables, we found that absolute power in the jump was incredibly important to throwing velocity. But when you decompose that, absolute power has a function of obviously force and velocity, and force is related to body weight. And when we looked at jump height, there was no relationship between jump height and throwing velocity, because the major covariant, the one that factored the most, was body mass. And so we understand, like, if our pitchers are losing body mass, they're not eating right, they're not hydrating. There's a physics equation called momentum, which is really important in throwing sports, rotational sports, every sport basically, but it's mass times velocity. So if you're losing mass and you're not moving faster, you're losing momentum, and it's going to affect your throwing velocity or sustainable throwing velocity. And so we wanted to optimize this. As athletes are improving their jump, they should also have an improvement in their lean body mass. And you're right, you hit it on the head, man. It's the nutritional habits that we need to get into working with our athletes. There's so many of these chaotic features about how to make a pitcher better at the game. And, a lot of these are like microcosms, little small elements that we're overseeing. And the thing is, with your business, you're hitting on these things, and we want to get there. I mean, we're taking the perspective of strength matters most, because we know that pain and availability, pain and dysfunction are the most important factors to remediate, because we need the pitchers available. But, all these things, like you're saying, the ability to sleep well, their hydration level, their nutrition, like, these are things that, a high school student doesn't really know. And even pros, they don't really know coming in. They don't have these habits. So, you are on the right track, in my opinion, to producing high level talent that are, draft ready, and guys who are already, pros to perform well, because they need that support. It's the stuff behind the scenes,
For sure.
when you're not on the mound, that matter.
I don't know if we're ready to pivot on the question, but it's bringing one up because obviously nutrition, anyone who's listened, Bart knows how much I'm on a warpath for especially high school kids. Eat freaking food. Just eat any way you can. But with that, and I listened to one of your videos on in-season training. And for me, in-season training, it's getting more traction in the baseball world. It's still not as solidified as I would like it to be.
Right.
Anyone, if you're listening on Spotify, obviously you can't see, I'm put together really well. I'm like 5'8" and 140 pounds. Like there's not too many people built like me. But when it comes down to it, I had a guy that I was working with, a couple kids at one of the high schools in my area. And I got a phone call from the head coach and said, you want my pitchers to run sprints in season and you want them lifting at least twice a week? Yeah, I do. And pretty much he said, if you keep working with Jordan, these guys you're not going to play for me because you're going to be tired and you're not going to be able to compete well.
Wow.
But the information's out there. If you're not training, you're going to lose all that jump power and everything Ryan was talking about, the lean body mass. You're going to dig yourself into a hole where you may feel fresh, but you're not going to perform the way you should. And if you want to go a little bit, because and if anyone who hasn't seen it, maybe Bart knows how to do this, you can maybe link that video in the description, because it's a fantastic overview of going a little more in depth on in-season training, because you need to keep that lean muscle mass. You have to sprint. There's so much. Oh, sorry to keep going on that, but you do a really good job.
Another resource you guys can link is we have a free in-season training program as well. So literally giving them a weight training program, giving them a throwing program. Hey, here's something you can follow in season, and it gives them some slight choice as well. So they can, choose between a few different exercises. It gives them the sets and reps and everything to follow, and links to how to do the exercises. But it's so important, and it's a balance, right? Like you can't just go and crush it to the same level that you would in the off season and expect that you're not going to be fatigued and sore. Like that very much does happen and can happen. And so I think that's where, lifting in season gets a bad rap, is because some coach somewhere along the way, like did 4 sets of 10 heavy squats in season, had to pitch the next day and was like, I didn't throw as well. My legs were tired. My legs were sore. And that very much is and can be a reality. And so it really comes down to knowing how to, fine tune that balance of volume and intensity. And that's what people don't understand. Our approach to it has kind of evolved a little bit in season. Before it was really like, let's just maintain strength and not be sore. And so you can do that easily. You just take an off-season lifting program, you cut the volume in half, you keep the intensity about 90% of what it was, and you won't get sore. You'll maintain your strength. So 4 sets of 10, 4 sets of 8 turns into 2 sets of 8, 1 to 2 sets of 8, 1 to 2 sets of 10. That works fine, but we've kind of slightly pivoted how we approach in-season training to where, hey, can we do better than just not making guys sore and maintaining their strength? Can we actually maybe address speed or power a little bit in season? And so we've had more of an emphasis on, hey, let's still keep the volume down, but can we hit some speed sets? Can we hit some power sets and actually try to improve some of those metrics without making them sore? So it might look something like, I got one rep range might be like 1 set of 3 heavy, 3 sets of 3 speed reps on a safety bar squat, right? You're not going to be sore from that. You're not going to be sore from 1 heavy set of 3 and 3 speed sets with, let's say, 40% of your 1 rep max. So you could just do 2 sets of 3, call it a day, or you could actually take the approach of, hey, we're actually going to get something out of this from a speed and power perspective as well. And so that's something we've pivoted a little bit, where you can still maintain strength. You can still not be sore for games, but we can still maybe get a little bit of that potentiating effect, but at the very least, at least be working on improving some metric in season. And so to me, that's a great place to do it.
Exactly. And then from that, it sounds like you're hitting a little bit of nervous system work with some speed, as well as building the strength around that as well. So you're going to have the skill and the strength kind of marry those two things together to help that guy develop.
I can jump in on this, because this is, he hit on an area that I think is really important, because in season, athletes lose power. And I train athletes a whole bunch of different ways. And finally, when I got to the Angels, the GM was all in. He's like, if you need equipment, I said, we need to train by velocity. We really need to understand how they're moving when we're working with bars. I don't want to run the risk of making them fatigued, just like what you're saying. They need to be able to auto-regulate. And some athletes, they may have a push band, or they might have something that they can monitor them. And training centers do. But what I can tell you from experience, from studying it and studying our entire minor leagues, is that in barbell compound lifts, the fastest rep is the second rep. The first rep is the potentiator. It gets you ready. But the second rep is the one that moves the fastest. And that's typically of almost all loads that are over 65%.
That's what we've seen. Anyone who's done velocity training, triples, knows that second rep is the best. Unless you lost the rep a little bit or something, it's always the second rep.
Yeah. So what we would do is that, especially if we had an athlete that needed to have hypertrophy, needed mass gains. And what we would do is we do modified German volume training. And so instead of doing like 10 by 10, it was modified that we would be doing like 10 sets of 3. We wanted to at least get those second reps involved, and we also understood, we had the coaching communication that when an athlete needed to gain lean mass, they needed to be on a different playing schedule. We needed to be able to have enough calories conserved that they could grow. And I think that's important too, is, the athlete has to have conversations with their coach. And, sometimes the two-way guy, who's the pitcher and the position player, it's going to be a hard time gaining mass, and they're playing all the time. So they need to have certain periods of time in their competitive week where they can recover and they can store energy and they can train, because, in season, obviously they have to perform, but even at the high school level, if they're a freshman in high school, they know that by their junior year, they have to start showing up. And so somewhere they have to either pay now or pay later. They have to have a trade-off of how they're going to approach this, but
that brings up a super important point, which, and again, we might not prioritize as much. Like, let's say we have a guy who needs to gain lean mass. In season, it is tough to do, admittedly. You might be able to gain a few pounds in season, but it is tough. It's so crucial for people to understand you don't have to compete year round, especially at the high school, and obviously in the college level, you're kind of stuck with whatever your coach is doing. Like if you're playing fall ball, you're playing fall ball. But realizing that you only have this very precious finite window of time in the off season to make these gains. And so this is the struggle that I ran into, like through high school, through college. Like I literally felt like the baseball gods were like working against me, because I was like, why do I only have 5 months to gain mass? Like if I could only have like 2 straight years where all I did was train, I would have gained the 40 pounds, like just like that in 2 years, and, been throwing 90 plus, but it was all broken up. In season, I couldn't make any progress. In the off season, I might gain 10, 15 pounds, do it all over again. Next off season, maybe gain 10, 15 pounds. But these sustained periods of just development, it's for some athletes, like the best decision they could make is to take a gap year for high school in particular, or to not play fall ball at the very least. Like take these long sustained periods of time to focus on your limiting factor. And if your limiting factor is lean mass, if it's nutrition, if it's strength training, like you're going to need time. It just takes time for your body to adapt. You can't gain 60 pounds overnight. Like that's a 2-year process. If you do everything perfectly, that's a 2-year process.
You're hitting it on the head. I mean, the guys that I've seen that we've brought in that have been really good, and just talking to them through their stories, are the guys in college. They finally get it in college where they skip the summer league. They just say, hey, once the season's over, I'm taking a week, doing a little bit of active recovery, working a little bit more on cardiovascular work, lessening the inflammation, and then I'm getting right to it. We get those guys that make those gains. They have those extended off seasons, and, they come back and they're so game ready. The thing that athletes don't get, specifically pitchers, is that the goal is to get to the major league level as soon as possible. Like the 7 years of, he needs to develop. We're going to have 5 to 7 years with them. Like, that's not a great concept. Like there needs to be a sense of urgency in every athlete, and they have to find a way to get there sooner. And really physically, like our GM said it best. He put a whole bunch of underweight guys in a room. He was unbelievable. And he just said, hey, if you don't weigh 180 pounds, you're not going to be promoted to the major league level. Because I don't trust that you're going to be able to sustain the physical, nature of the game. And we need you to grow. We can't have a velocity loss out of you. We need sustained velocity. And he just said it straight, and the behavior, like you're getting obviously we had a great dietitian and Becky Twombly, she's outstanding. But when you hear this from the GM, oh man, the behavior's changed, and that's the thing is like, we need to get our athletes to be game ready. If you know that you're lacking physical size and you're looking at your velocity records and they're kind of all over the place, you need to make that sacrifice. You really do. Because once you get into a professional setting, it's either you put up or you're put out. You need to put those numbers up and you need to advance quickly. You have to be able to do that. So
that point comes back to being able to kind of zoom out and take a wide perspective at like, what are my limiting factors? Like, do I need to play summer ball? Like, as for a college guy, do I need to play summer ball to like refine my third best pitch and like work on my holds with a runner on second? Like, is that my limiting factor, or do I need to gain 20 pounds over the next, like, do I want from June until next February to gain 20 pounds instead of from like September till February to gain 20 pounds? Right. Like being able to zoom out and really understand like the 2 or 3 areas that are going to propel them to the next level. It's usually not like just continue playing. Now it can be like, if you have a guy already throwing 97 in college and like he just has some command issues and he has some mental issues and he's game reps to work on that. And he needs more game reps and game exposure to work on the specificity of like that mental stress. He probably does need to go play summer ball. Like there is a time to actually go and play, a longer period of the year. Like a guy maybe who's hurt all spring, he probably should go play summer ball now that he's healthy and get those reps. But there's so many times, like we have guys come here, their college coaches will send them like powerhouse schools and they'll say like, I've got 3 guys who need to develop. Like I'd rather send them to you and know they're taken care of than just send them off to summer ball, have them get 12 innings and like come back the same pitcher.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was something we dealt with a lot on the professional side of it. Was we would get an athlete who, even if it's a player that just came over from the Dominican, he may be 6'4", 155 pounds, great fastball velocity, not much on the secondary pitches, and the command's kind of all over the place. So it's one of those things that me and Ryan put a lot of effort into trying to get, in a sense, we just called it like a prep program to where these guys would kind of be in a different group. They're only going to throw live BPs. They're not going to go face the other teams in a uniform until they're ready, until they've hit these check marks. They're still going to throw bullpens. They're going to focus on this development. And one of the big pushbacks, and again, this is just kind of a way a lot of baseball still thinks is, well, we need to go play those games because the only way we're going to get better is by playing games. There is some truth to that, but there's also a lot that's false with that, because there's a lot of players that skip summer ball or they take the gap year. And now they've refined those things and they've dialed that in through a practice setting. And then when they roll back into a game, let's say they just made 15% progress as a whole in a 3-month time span, as opposed to playing games, needing to worry about, overloading, underloading, handling your super compensations and everything that goes along with that. And now you only got 3% better. So which one was more beneficial? And again, it's very context specific. If you have the guy that, hey, I don't know what we're going to do from a strength standpoint. His nutrition's fantastic. He's already got 3+ pitches. He just can't throw a strike whenever a hitter steps in the box. Get that guy into some games. So I think you hit it perfect of saying that's very context specific, that you're not going to recommend every player take a gap year. Not every player needs 3 months to skip summer ball and dial in one specific aspect. They may need to get out there and play summer ball. And I think that's really important, is there's not a right answer for everyone, but there's a right answer for the individual given the context of the circumstance.
Yeah. Just to add on to that before we move on. We kind of look at it like, in like a MLB The Show, like create a player, you have all these different like metrics, right? And you can like toggle up certain ones, but you only have so many like whatever, like points to assign. So like you can toggle up like arm strength and velocity, but then like certain metrics are going to be a little lower, certain ones are going to be higher. Ideally, you want to toggle all those all the way up, right? That's your super player. But ultimately, you have a limited number of resources, right? You have a limited amount of time of recovery. You can only focus on so many of these things at one time in a specific training block. Like physiologically, your body can't adapt to 12 different things at once anyway, especially if they're conflicting stimuli. So we need to allocate our time and our training resources as appropriately as we can. And so just if the athlete actually understands like, hey, these are where all my metrics are, this is what I need to do, it becomes a lot easier conversation with the athlete. It becomes a lot easier conversation with the coach to say like, I'm going to take off from summer ball to actually focus on these things because this is actually where I need to, crank up the dial. I'm already 95th percentile on these things. I'm 30th percentile over here. I better crank those up. And so it just becomes an easier conversation. Usually it's a conversation with their college coach, which that becomes the tension point, or their high school coach, to be able to actually provide a little bit of data, a little bit of context. And then it becomes a much easier thing to implement.
Yep. So Ben, you said you've listened to the podcast. I'm sure you've heard me say, hey, if you got questions, submit questions. We want to hear them. We'll address them on other podcasts. I'm knowing Jordan and Ryan's background and their experience. I'm very curious what questions you would have for them that you would pose to them.
Okay. I have a number of them written down. It kind of depends what direction we want to take this. Would you guys rather talk about stride length? Talk about lead, ground reaction forces on the lead leg, kind of similar. Talk about grip strength and injury, or would you rather talk about potentiation?
I think if we can, we could talk about all three. We just have to be concise. I think those are great. You choose one.
Okay, let's do stride length. I chose that because I know that's kind of your wheelhouse. I'd like if you could kind of summarize for people, like what are your thoughts on like the sweet spot for stride length? Because some people are like, I need to get stride as long as possible and just do a bunch of talent drills. And some are like, no, you need to throw exactly like XYZ big leaguer has a short stride because they throw 100, like Joe Kelly throws 100 and he doesn't have a super long stride, or Gratterall doesn't stride super far. And then other people are like, you got to throw like Chapman. He strides super far. What is the sweet spot and how do we find that sweet spot? And then I'll kind of give my take as well.
Yeah, like I think stride lengths are really determined based on the anatomical, the musculoskeletal system. Does the athlete have the right mobility? Do they have the right strength and power to be able to project themselves into a further landing point? Those things are really important. In my research, and I studied college pitchers primarily. I had 4 high school kids that were really upper level high school pitchers. They were all drafted. I really manipulated their stride length. I mean, I just want to see what could these guys do and what happens to the body mechanics if we really don't have a good concept of where stride length needs to be. Some of them would stride around, the average was at the lowest level, they'd stride at 52%, at the highest level, 76%, when they were going beyond their typical stride length. Most of the athletes, when you measure between the two heels, were on average in their desired stride length were around 69%. So they weren't like at the 80+% that you normally see. But the cool thing about the research is that the velocity was the same. It didn't matter what they did. It was the same. And so in my world of strength matters most, this is why, I just had a publication accepted to look at grip strength change with stride length change. What happens to the throwing arm's grip strength neurologically when you have a change in stride length? And when pitchers would reduce their stride, which can happen when they're fatigued, the grip strength loss went up. So that something challenged the flexors of the pronator flexor mass during this period. And so for me, the stride length is very individual. If you're capable of getting the athlete over 70% body height, you have a better chance of throwing at higher velocities at lower levels. On average, remember they're outliers. But for me, this is why I love our product with arm care, is to make sure that the arm is strong, because there is a strong distal connection. If the athlete has a really far stride length, they may have greater linear momentum and they might not have to rotate as fast, right? That's another research paper that we did on momentum. If the athlete doesn't stride very far, then they have to increase their rotational momentum. They have to pick that up to create velocity. In both scenarios, you need to have, in the high rotational velocity, short stride length, they need to have a ton of strength, because the arm is going to lag. When you have to increase the speed of your trunk, your arm's going to lag behind, and you don't want to have extra stress to the arm and have any weak points. Now, you do need that strength for your longer stride lengths, but it's not as critical, because they seem to manage the rotational velocity. They become less rotational as a pitcher, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what I can see is, obviously identifying where there could be limitations of velocity. If they're increasing their stride and they're gaining velocity, then there needs to be training to support the sustainability of that velocity. And there has to be the two-way communication with the athlete to say, yes, this is comfortable. I'm able to continue this. There's a conditioning effect, I believe, in terms of increasing velocity, because I've studied also the endocrinologic component and the blood analytes that I looked at. I looked at all the, lactic acid. I looked at blood glucose. I looked at all these different things in pitchers and what happened to stride length. So it needs to be trained. But if the athlete, can give you some comfort, then they might say, this is the right self-organization for me. This is what feels right for me. So in all aspects of stride length, I mean, we talk about, our product being evaluating the throwing arm. We just have to ensure there's no weak links there. The proximal component has an effect on the throwing arm. And, we just want to make sure that component is looked after, because also, stride length changes over the course of the season. There's going to be adaptability in the stride length. And so, an athlete that may become, linear becomes more rotational. So that's why I'm saying my message is strength matters most, and it can cover, these changes in stride length, or maybe a stride length that's not optimal.
For sure.
Yeah.
Would you agree, just real quick, would you agree that there is such a thing as too long of a stride for an individual? Yeah,
for sure. I mean, we have one, so I'm putting together an arm care IQ that shows an athlete that's got too long of a stride that he's actually airborne. So, what happens is it can affect arm timing. And if what's happening is that if they're in the air and their foot's off the ground and they're already at early layback, that's an issue as well, because now you don't have your back leg to be a rudder. So, what can happen even with short stride lengths is they pull everything in. If you think it's like, it's like a figure skater, when they want to increase rotational speed, they're pulling everything in. But now this is, and they're trying to increase their momentum in rotation. But what happens with these longer strides is that this gets disjointed. Now things are way too long and the arm may be fast. And so they're just out of sync. So it is possible.
Right. You kind of see both sides of the spectrum. If their stride is too short, the arm tends to be late. And if the stride is too long, the arm tends to be early.
Yeah.
But what is an early or a late arm? The arm can only be early or late relative to foot strike, relative to what the lower half is doing. So what is a late arm? A late arm can actually just be a short stride or an early stride. What is an early arm? It could actually just be your stride is too long. So you have to look at the arm timing in relation to what the lower half is doing. It's not just like this independent thing where your arm is just here for no reason, or your arm is for no reason.
Yeah. And they're finally starting to put some information out on that arm, timing, arm position. They're finding, it's not really that relevant. But then when you start factoring in what's going on below that, now you have relevancy of what's happening with the arm, because just like you said, Ben, it's all in relation to what's happening below that. You can't be late if you're not in the right, if everything below it's not in the right position anyway. So it's got to be in correlation with what's going on below it.
Yeah, there's obviously I point to research. I try to study as much as possible, but there was one research article that looked at the inverted position of the arm and in early trunk rotation, and they found that when they compared the inverted position, there was no difference in injury risk. So this inverted W didn't have any relationship to injuries versus what was considered a healthy arm position at foot flat, a weight bearing foot flat. And so the key is what's happening with the trunk with that arm. You know, if you have a guy that's rotating early and the chest is starting to square up the home plate and that arm hasn't achieved at least parallel to the ground, you know, then you're going to have this incredible speed that you have to get your arm to catch up. You know, but it's really interesting. But I think the relationship with the trunk is really important. Like, when does it start to open? Where is the arm in that position? That might be the best determinant of what's the right stride length, you know,
For sure.
From a mechanical perspective.
For sure. And that also highlights how difficult it is to pin an injury on any one specific variable.
Yeah.
Because there are so many variables. There's so much going on biomechanically. There's so much going on with each individual that you're studying, like their strength deficits. Maybe they have perfect mechanics, but they have a strength deficit. Maybe they were under recovered on the day of the study. Like, there's so many variables that you could pick almost any variable and try to correlate it to injury. You're going to have a hell of a time actually doing that unless you have just thousands and thousands and thousands of data points, just because there's so much going on.
Yeah.
So it's so difficult to actually study that, to study the relationship of injury to one specific variable.
Yeah.
The best variable might be fatigue. Like fatigue,
Yeah.
we know for sure is linked to that, but that might be the one thing that really has that extremely strong, undeniable relationship.
I believe, like what you're saying, when it comes to mechanics, I believe that everybody has inherent variability that they need. So there's an amount of variability that's healthy, where the movement is, there's the right attractors. I mean, in terms of the stable states in the delivery, they're there, but there's a lot of the variability how they get to those attractor states was within a range. And like what you're saying, I believe fatigue changes now that variability. And when they look at the variability of the system, you know, people in biomechanics, they look at different positions like peak knee height, foot contact, maximal external rotation, ball release, maximal internal rotation. They're looking at all these discrete events in the delivery, but it's the variability and the linking of those events that I think is where people are going to see certain signals that say, okay, when the athlete has this particular amount of variability, you know, and it changes, that could potentially be a risk factor. You know, what we want to be able to do is take the strength perspective, because if they're neurologically strong, they're fatigue resistant, right? The other thing too, we talked about hypertrophy. When they have more tissue, they can handle more stress, because stress is, the formula is force over cross-sectional area. You just got more tissue to handle that stress. And so when we have those things, we are hedging the bet that we'll be able to stand up to when the variability becomes destabilized. You know, and then the other thing too, you look at injured pitchers, and Jordan's worked with a lot of injured pitchers, I'm sure you have too, Ben, is that pre and post injury, they sometimes don't look different. So like prior to the injury, they become less variable. Their variability becomes more invariable, which is also an issue. So this is why the world of pitching health, you know, it has to take a strength perspective, and it has to identify how does this affect the mechanical efficiency of the delivery in terms of their variability, in my opinion, to answer those questions.
On that as well, you know, we're talking about the health side and where it relates to a stride length, you know, stride angle, whatever it is we want to look at with that. But one important thing to consider too is the actual quality of the pitch. So, you know, you might get a guy into an optimal, stride length where you are seeing an improvement in the kinematic sequence, better arm positions, however you want to quantify that. But if you're seeing a regression in, you know, the ride of a fastball or the depth of a breaking ball, or all of a sudden he's throwing 2 miles an hour slower, or even, you know, hey, we added 4 miles an hour, but we just gave him a BP shaped fastball. Like, those are technically not positive changes. So you got to be really factoring it in. I know we were talking, I think it was before we started recording, is everyone has these tools. Almost everybody has tools available at their disposal to measure with Rapsodo or Edgertronic, whatever it may be. But you need to understand when things are getting better, worse, or staying the same. And that's going to help quantify what's going on with those mechanical adjustments as well. As there's a lot of great info out there, and it's tough to say. And, you know, one of the questions I had, which I'm going to ask you a little bit later, is obviously on, you know, that everyone's calling it lumbopelvic control, and just the difference of, you know, everted retroverted answer. There's a million words and I'm not bright enough to remember all of them, but it's something that I've talked about with Croton, and understanding those variables within a person's anatomy is going to impact stride length, stride angle, the way you load, what your pitch shapes could inevitably end up looking like. So it's not just a health standpoint. And I don't know if you want to jump on that a little bit too, of looking at it multifaceted.
Yeah. You have to be able to see the whole picture, right? And this comes back to not having a siloed approach where, one coach needs to be able to be at the very least familiar with these other avenues. The most common area where we see this, and you kind of alluded to this, in pro ball, we see it with all this data with TrackMan and Rapsodo, is coaches will be like, they'll pick a certain metric that they want to improve, which is great, right? Like if a guy is a high carry guy and he's an 18-inch vertical break guy, like maybe we want to get him to 20 inches of vertical break. But what they'll do is they'll sell out for that metric and not realize that the guy just dropped 4 miles an hour because now he's just cheating his elbow above the plane and just trying to push the ball to get 12.6 backspin. But really he's a low 3/4 arm slot guy. And so you've just changed what made him successful. You've just changed his mechanics. You've just changed his lower half. Like all these unintended consequences happen up and down the chain at the expense of chasing that one metric. This is the most common thing we're seeing now, because everyone has this technology and they still don't really fully understand the implications of it. So like, just to put that out there, like cheating the elbow up when chasing vertical break is far and away the most, it's the thing that bothers me the most right now that I see in pro ball. Is you'll take a guy who shouldn't be a vertical break guy. He's a sinker, like he should be a sinker guy. And they're just coaching everybody to be the same. Everyone needs to be a high carry guy. It's like, wait, I had 5 inches of vertical and like 20 inches of horizontal. Why are you making me throw, a high carry four seam? Like that doesn't necessarily make sense for every player. And even if it does make sense for the player, it only makes sense if you can improve that metric while at the very least holding everything else stable. Like we had one guy that we just consulted with, former like top 10 round pick. He was throwing 96 when he was drafted. Now he's throwing 90. And we took one look at his video before and after, and we're like, he's definitely been working on carrying his fastball. And so we got on a call with him. It's like, yeah, I pretty much spent a whole year just trying to carry the fastball. And like his elbow basically started coming up here. He was karate chopping into ball release instead of whipping his arm out and around. Like everything started to deteriorate just to chase this one metric. So to your point, you just have to be able to understand how any change you make, mechanical, if it's from the data side, if it's from the strength side, if you can monitor all the metrics that are important and have those at your fingertips, then as things start to change, everything's always in flux, but as things start to change, you can identify those problems way ahead of time instead of looking back 2 years later, like, crap, what happened? Mm-hmm. And then they come to us and we have to like put the pieces together, like what happened to get to this point? Like, why is this guy who threw 99-mile-an-hour sinkers 2 years ago, like I'm thinking of one big leaguer we work with in particular, like why is he throwing 92 with forearm pain? And so we had to literally like put all the pieces together of like where he got screwed up by his organization. Oh, wait, they like started having him preset his hinge. They got rid of his forward move, like his drift and his athletic delivery. And they started making him throw like a robot. Oh, that's interesting. What happened after there? Oh, your velo dropped 4 miles an hour. Okay. Oh, then you had forearm pain. Like you have to appreciate how all these things come together. So I'll stop the rant there, but it's just important.
That's dead on. And there's been a ton of players that, with organization A that, gets drafted and these are true stories. I'm not going to use names, but they have a player come in and they want him to learn how to do a double balance point in his delivery. I'm not sure exactly what that looks like or how you would even explain that, but they start having him do a double balance point.
Is that the Marcus Stroman, like pause pitch thing?
I have a pretty weird imagination and I can't come up with something for it. So I don't know exactly what it looks like. But they do that. And then we sign a guy at X velo and he starts dropping down to losing that velo. And then this is also a true part of the story. He goes to Tread Athletics and he gets rid of the double balance point, whatever that may be. And he actually gains velo, comes back and he looks like a new pitcher. And then they trade that guy. And it's like, hey, he's got his velo gain. Let's get this guy, trade him. He gets traded. And all of a sudden this other organization realized there's more than one plane that you can develop a pitch on. Right. You can go up and down, you can go left and right, you can go forward and back. And then they start going, oh, we don't just need to develop only a four seam going this way. What if we got him moving the ball this way based on that arm slot? And then all of a sudden, next thing you know, the guy's in the big leagues less than 3 months later because someone was willing to look at it, even if it was just, hey, here's one piece of the puzzle. these guys fix that. Here's one other piece. And now we can add that. Now we got a big leaguer. And it's just little things of being able to go, I don't have all the answers. And I'm going back to the log now of what makes a good coach is someone who's screwed it up enough to know what doesn't work or what's going to work for a specific body type. And that's just the unique thing about it is my anatomy is different than yours. Yours is different than Ryan's, and Bart's is different than whoever else's we want to compare Bart to. And each one of us are going to have different needs, different, physiological structure. And I'm using this as kind of my segue into, the lumbopelvic control, loading, knee dominant, quad dominant, things like that, and exactly how your hips are, internally rotated and externally rotated. Because there's also another, I'm just going to call it an issue in baseball to where they want everyone loading the exact same. Yep. They go, okay, well, we're talking on chasing that metric. Well, now we need every player loading the same. And then I'll get a phone call from someone. Hey, I got your number from so-and-so. I've lost 5 miles an hour in my first year of pro ball. What's going on? And then again, you'll look at the before and after. They're chasing that metric because you go on Twitter, you go on YouTube, everyone's talking about load, but then no one's really explaining it the way that you are with the different types of, design of the pelvis and everything that goes along with that. If you don't mind jumping on that a little bit too.
Yeah. So I think the overarching theme is that coaches who think they know a lot are more likely to do harm than good, the higher the level of the athlete. So this mostly happens in pro ball because you have athletes that are at such a high level that come in throwing mid-90s that have fine-tuned what they're capable of. It's not that they don't have room to continue to improve, but these guys are closer to their peak than a college guy or a high school guy. And so any change that you try to make to a guy who's already that close to their peak is vastly more likely to do damage than to have a positive benefit than, let's say you're working with a guy who throws 60 miles an hour in high school. Anything you do with him, like he's flying open elbow, like he has no idea what he's doing, stepping with the wrong foot, like anything you do with that guy is going to get him better. Whereas almost anything you do to Garrett Cole is going to get him worse. And so having an appreciation of that is like having just respect for the fact that that's the reality. I don't think a lot of pro coaches have that. They're like, oh, I know so much about mechanics. Like this is how you have to throw. And then they apply that to a staff of big leaguers or a staff of pro guys. And that might work for 4 of them. And it might make 4 of them completely worse. And it might kind of have a, null effect on the other 8 guys. So I don't think there's an appreciation for that fact that I know when I start working with a big leaguer that I better be dead on and I better tiptoe into that change and I better measure if that change is helping so that we can back out if it's not helping.
Yeah.
I better measure the metric we're trying to improve and monitor the other things, make sure those are not getting worse and have the subjective stuff like, hey, how does it feel? Like, is that comfortable? Is that repeatable? All those things better be telling me like this is a full go and I shouldn't be in the middle of a season, like all these variables. If that's the case, then we keep tiptoeing into the change and then we go with it. But there are so many times where like what I think I know is not actually what gets the results in the athlete. Mm-hmm. So you could think that like, okay, here's an example, the drift. I'll get to this example with as far as like different hip structure, right? Most high level throwers have an athletic drift. They have a dynamic weight shift during their leg lift. They don't come to a balance point. Okay. That being said, there have been cases where I've tried to teach the move to a guy already throwing mid-90s and they actually get worse. Like they do the move properly and now they're throwing 92, 93. But because we're measuring everything after a bullpen in the off season, so we're not going to do that in season. In the off season, I'm like, you're already at a good spot. I'm not going to screw you up. I think I know, like I thought I knew this, but it turns out I didn't know. Like it turns out this actually screwed something else up in the kinetic chain. I could force the change through and just make him throw 92, 93 and like feel uncomfortable. Or I can say like, despite what I think I know, despite my philosophy, we're going to actually go with what's eliciting the results for you. And a lot of pro coaches don't do that. They say, I think that the heel has to stay engaged with the rubber the entire linear move. I think that has to happen. And even if you throw 99 and your heel comes up early, we're going to change that. Even if it makes you throw 92, we're still going to keep that change because that's what I know and I'm always right. Whereas I would say, wait a second, your heel is coming up, you're throwing 99. Now you're keeping your heel down and presetting a hinge, you're throwing 92. Why don't we go back to what you were doing, right? Despite what you think you know, if they've already proved that a different way is better for them, we have to be willing and open to do that. And so like every big leaguer I work with is a guy who used to be a stud and like got screwed up somewhere along the way. And that's why they reached out to us. And it's always like, almost always it's an injury or it's a coach that thought they knew something, forced that change through, even though the player knew intuitively that this was not a positive change. They always intuitively can feel like something's off. Velo drops, something feels off, command gets worse, the change gets forced through, and they're just like, they just go down this path, and then they can't figure out what went wrong, and then they're out of baseball. So that being said, one of the areas where that happens is not understanding an athlete's hip structure and trying to cue the lower half the exact same for everybody. And so basically the idea is we have different, obviously different body types, different anthropometry, limb lengths, et cetera. One of the differences is actually in our pelvic structure and our hip structure. And so without getting too detailed, basically you need to know that some athletes have really good hip internal rotation and really bad hip external. Some athletes are the opposite. They've got really good hip external rotation, right? They can sit cross-legged. They can do like a frog stretch really easily, but they have really poor hip internal rotation. They can't do that knee to knee position very well. So I can share my screen here and just kind of show you guys some examples. I swear I didn't know you were going to ask this question. This was a question I was going to ask to you guys and then bring up. Okay, we're going to show. This is a really obvious example comparing these. Okay, so different guys have different amounts of hip external and different amounts of hip internal. You're going to see kind of three groups. About 60% of guys, give or take, are going to have decent hip internal rotation, decent hip external rotation. They're going to be somewhere in between, right? That might be someone like a Garrett Cole. It's really easy to see though on the extremes. So Fulte, we'll just watch him throw. He's a guy with really good hip external. I never assessed him. I don't need to assess him to know that because I've worked with enough players and I know this is what happens. So you look at the position that he gets into right here. He's cleared the front leg. He's externally rotating the front leg and he's holding the back leg back. So he's in this externally rotated position. That's the position where he can hold this stable pelvic posture and this stable trunk posture and move down the mound in this externally rotated position. Edwin Diaz, he's the opposite. So right there is a good example. He's in that knee to knee position. Both hips are in this internally rotated position, knee to knee. And so that's a position where if you were to measure his hip internal rotation, you can already see from right here, he's got 40 plus degrees of hip IR just from the position of his lead leg. But these are guys who are kind of on the other extreme and their hips are very much biased towards IR. And what that means is basically if you look at the shin angles, again, they're in this more knee to knee position. They actually hold this lead leg in more IR. So they're going to be guys who tend to show the bottom of the cleats towards the catcher for a lot longer. And they're going to have more counter rotation of their pelvis. I mean, Edwin Diaz just absurd like positions that he gets into, kind of demonstrating that. And then Fulte is kind of the opposite, where you'll see he clears this early. And again, doesn't really have any counter rotation with his leg lift. What you'll see with guys who are ER dominant, if they lift with a ton of coil, if he brought the knee way back here, like Josh Hader, he actually wouldn't be able to clear the leg in time. So he wouldn't be able to immediately get it open and clear like that. So what we've seen with working with certain guys like this, if we can and Corbin Burns is another example, Justin Verlander is another example. If they get too much counter rotation during their leg lift, they actually can't clear the lead leg like this early, and they end up swinging the leg out and around, and then they end up basically not being able to get a good lead leg block. So, and Ryan, I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. We tend to notice with ER guys, they clear the lead leg early and they come into landing much more straight on into landing. So they land with their foot straight onto the target, the hard throwers, versus landing closed or landing cross body. They land straight onto the target and they block straight through that lead leg. Yeah. Whereas guys with good IR, a lot of times what you'll see is they'll land, and again, Diaz is just one example of that. There's a lot of different examples. The IR guys can make it work if they land closed with the front foot or cross body, because they have the hip internal rotation to actually get around that. Yeah. Guys without it can't get around it. They better clear it early, land straight on, and block right through it. And so it's just understanding like there's these different categories and buckets you can place pitchers in based on their mobility. And if you've done an appropriate movement screen, you can start to see like, oh, like what, okay, so here's what happens if you don't have any IR and you land cross body. This foot will roll out on you, the knee will bow out, and you're going to have a really crappy lead leg block because you don't have the hip IR to actually get around the lead leg block. And so it's not as much like you only understand that if you understand their mobility screen. You're like, there is no way you're going to open up 20 more degrees of IR if that's a bony block for that guy. So let's just get him, instead of cross body, let's get him striding on target. Instead of landing close, let's get him landing on target, and it cleans it up right away. So understanding the connections between their mobility and their mechanics. And this was a huge light bulb moment a couple of years ago for us, was just recognizing like, oh crap, this is what's happening. And maybe 10% of guys are in this one camp, 10% are in the other, 80% are somewhere in the middle. And it's not this clean cut thing, but that's still something that you can test, you can try, you can play with how open or closed they stride. You can play with how closed the front foot is. And typically you're going to find out pretty quickly what their preference is.
Yeah. We had a player, phenomenal pitcher, that ended up going out of baseball because of chronic shoulder issues. He was an external guy that became internal, and not only internal, in terms of his delivery, they pushed him. He was a right-hander. They pushed him more towards third. He was on opposite ends of the mound of the rubber. And so what was happening is that he developed FAI, like an impingement issue that became a labral tear of his hip. And
which is super easy to predict, right? Like if you realize that he was running out of room in that joint, didn't have the IR, and you're just going to jam him into that position, like, you know, you or I could have told them from a mile away, like, you're going to have a labral tear eventually. Like if you're just grinding down on that joint.
And
right?
this is to jump more into what we were saying earlier too, is this was a player who has already been in the big leagues before these changes were put in. And I'm pretty sure I know who you're talking about, Ryan. But you know, he's a Ferrari. So a Ferrari has very tight tolerances. If you start adding I've never once seen a Ferrari with aftermarket parts. Just me. I've seen plenty of Honda Civics with aftermarket parts. A lot looser tolerances. They're not as precision engines, things like that. But when you start taking the way that a guy is moved, and this athlete at the time was 26, 27, Ryan?
Yeah.
Right in that age range. And they said, you've been doing this for over 20 years. You've really never had any major issues, but because of the way you're moving, we're predicting you're going to have an issue.
Right.
So then with all good intentions, the coach makes the change. And then the athlete, being a highly coachable individual, makes the change. He's athletic. He's able to change that movement really quickly. Then we flare up a hip and the kinematic sequence changes. Oh, now all of a sudden you need shoulder surgery. Oh, by the way, you're never going to pitch again. So just little things that, understanding that, making those tweaks when you're dealing with the Ferrari. And you know, like you said, this is a big leaguer. How does it feel? What else is this impacting? It all has to come into account. And that's why for me is something that so many people overlook is, the length of a femur versus the tibia. The pelvis anatomy is going to dictate how a guy is going to be moving in that natural sense. And then when they've been doing it for longer and having success, you start running the risk of turning the Ferrari into the Volkswagen Bug.
For sure. And that's just that story is a shame, because it's an example of like a coach thinking he knows something, even though it directly conflicts with the results, the on-field results, and what the player's body is telling you and what the player is feeling.
And then the worst part about it is now that coach goes, I told you he was going to get hurt. Well, no, that happened because of the intervention.
Exactly. And that's how it goes. It's the coaches who think they know everything, that regardless of the outcome that happens, they're right. Right. Like immediately, like changing everything about every player when they get drafted. And then the 9 out of 10 that it doesn't work for, it's like, oh, they just didn't have it.
They're uncoachable.
Right. They're uncoachable. Or you brought up coachability. I feel like fairly passionate about that, because I was a guy who like actually educated myself, and still all these changes were kind of forced through on me, even after I'd had success in my first first season. And I was like, okay, we're going to just change these 7 things because like you don't look conventional. But the guy who actually educates himself and has a reason for why I've tried that before, that didn't work, here's why, like that guy then gets flagged as uncoachable when really they're the guy who, like, it should be a collaborative process. And that's how we address and approach coaching, is collaborating with the athlete. Like, I don't just go into a programming for an athlete like this is what we're going to do. You have a hypothesis, like you think this is going to work, you think you understand what's going on, but you better actually test and you better actually talk to the athlete and understand like what they're feeling and understand that side of it too. Because the second the athlete tells me like, hey, like that change, like I know you said it was gonna help, but like it felt terrible, my hips pinched and my velo was down 3, like I'm backing off that change. I'm not forcing that change through, even if I think that he should be a vertical shin guy, because like that's what my philosophy tells me.
Yeah.
And I know Ryan's got a lot to say on this too. And, one of the things me and Ryan have always talked about is we wanted to educate our athletes with as much as they wanted to know. If an athlete just said, hey, tell me what I need to do, okay, we'll do that. But if they want to know what, why, and how are we going to do this, I'm all for educating the athlete as much as possible. I just spoke with an organization, maybe it was on Friday, something like that. And one of their big concerns was, well, what are we going to do when the players ask questions? Well, we don't want to. Well, you should educate yourself as well, so you can explain this information to them. That's very important to do. Is if you're going to be in a position of authority, you better have those answers. And I got a lot of pushback for it, because there was times that I would tell an athlete, I don't know, but let's find this out together.
Right.
And well, you can't tell them you don't know. Well, that's how you build trust. This is a relationship.
Right. Like,
if we don't have an answer,
are you supposed to make up that? Like, don't just make something up. Like, say you don't know. And that,
exactly.
Like, that just drives me crazy, because the people the coaches that I know, like some like Hall of Fame caliber names in the college coaching world, and some really well-respected pro coaches, like the best coaches that I know are the ones who are most open to learning and the most humble and willing to say they don't know.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
Like, I'm thinking of like Scott Brown, Brent Strom, Nate Yeski. Like I'm thinking like these are the most humble guys who recognize that they don't have it figured out. And they're actually the ones who are the experts, and the guys that, think they have it figured out aren't.
And I think one of the key ththings you said on there was, I don't remember if you said it was a pivot point for you when you started looking into the pelvis, or as an eye-opening experience for your group. And that's the thing, is that's the learning aspect of going, oh, here's something we didn't know about, and here's how we can fold this into our system.
For sure. And credit to Eugene Bleecker for, I had a conversation with him, and it kind of spawned this whole, discovery. So I'm going to give him a shout out too, because again, he definitely was part of that kind of realization. And we took that and ran with it and kind of built out like, okay, here's exactly how we need to adjust our training approach based upon this light bulb moment.
I think one of the things that we need to think about in coaching is that we shouldn't think of ourselves as directors, but more as consultants. Like we need to allow the athlete to pick and choose things that we're saying that they resonate with.
Yep.
Because, and you said it best, a humble coach is one that knows how to pivot. The stubborn, proud coach is the one that sticks with a plan that isn't working. And they don't have the concept of, I am going to consult for you, and I may not get it right, but we're going to figure it out. And they need to have some time constraints in terms of what that should be. Is it 2 outings? It certainly shouldn't be longer than a month with a pro athlete. That's far too long. And they need to have discussions around that. They need to have, this is where we're going to evaluate you. And if we don't see an improvement, we're going to make a pivot. But they need to have that laid out to the athlete so that they give themselves the opportunity to make changes. And they let the athlete know that they don't have the exact direction right now, but they have an idea. Because you fall into a big problem when you direct, and then the athlete resents you because you're unwilling to make the change that they want to see. And I think that's an important piece of communication. I mean, yep. I obviously oversaw strength and conditioning for the Angels, and there were athletes that said, hey, I just want to go and jog. And for me, I was trying to educate them, the hip lock position, the knee to knee separation is very similar in pitching from sprinting. When you jog, you don't have those positions. And this athlete just said, well, it makes me feel better. Well, then of course you need to do it.
Right.
I'm not going to fight you. when you have a mental model that this is something that you need to do. Even though I've done everything I can to educate you why another option is better for you athletically as a pitcher. And we just need to get to that point. Sometimes the athlete has to hold our hand.
Yeah. And that just brings up the fact that like something might be quote unquote ideal in theory. Like the ideal thing might be to take like these 50 recovery supplements and like, use a red light in the sauna and like get 10 and a half hours of sleep and like monitor everything with your whoop strap. And like, you might have this perfect ideal, like textbook thing of what they need to do. But in reality, it's like, no, like I like having this routine. Like this works for me. This helps me feel prepared and ready. And a lot of these little details aren't worth fighting the athlete on if they feel strongly about it.
Yeah.
Right. Like
and that goes back into education.
Exactly. And maybe you educate them and they can come to terms with like, oh, I'm going to tweak a couple of things here or there because now I see the reasoning behind why jogging might not be as beneficial as XYZ. But they need to be on board with that change. If a change is just like forced through, they're not going to be committed to that change. And they're either not going to follow it or they're going to follow it half-heartedly.
Yeah. I mean, one of the other things that we need to understand is coaching, especially with the elite level athletes, you sometimes have to wait for them to fail. They sometimes have to come to you, like Ben, you're getting guys that are really, they're struggling. So they're very open to change. But when they're on the inside walls of a pro setting, you kind of have to be patient if they're not catching what you're putting out right away, and they have to come to you to say, hey, I need help. If you're going in there guns a-blazing, trying to change your first round pick in the first week that you get them in an organization, you haven't given him a chance to show you what he can do. You got to give the player a fair chance before you want to go in and tinker, because just like what you're saying, you're getting these athletes that have been kind of manhandled, and they need to have an opportunity to say, hey, like I'm not even getting a chance to show you what I can do.
Yep.
And the coach, like great coaching is trust building. And how, like, we know, like at work, we start a new job. Imagine that your boss is starting to already pick you apart and you haven't even produced a work sample yet. Like that's not effective. That's not effective leadership and coaching. So, what you guys are saying is just, it's awesome. We're all saying the same thing.
Yeah, I think it's important. You said the coach needs to view themselves as a consultant. And I would even go one step further and say they need to view themselves as a tour guide. It's the coach's job to get the players on the bus and point out, hey, here's the Eiffel Tower. Here's this. And then if they're wanting more information and someone on the bus raises their hand, that's where you can start going more in depth on what that is. Mm-hmm. And you're directing them where it is they want to go. And Ben pointed out earlier, during the introduction, that if a player's goal is A, B, and C, you don't say, well, now your goal's E, F, and G. No, we're still going to help you accomplish your goal, because at the end of the day, this is the player's career. It's our job to help them, be educated and to make those decisions to where they can do that on their own. Obviously, you can't take Ben with you on the mound. You can't take me with you on the mound. You can't take Ryan with you to the weight room, and you can't take Bart with you out to the surf. But if we were educating those players enough on what it is they need to do when they step between the lines, they're going to be able to make those decisions on their own when it's actually, the lights are on and it matters. And that's the goal. Is we're tour guides, we're consultants, we're long-term development specialists that are helping these guys be the best coach that they can be for themselves as well, and to impact the game when they're done playing, and just keep going on and on and on. I don't know if that made any sense. I'm good for one ramble every day.
No, that's so true. We'll have random moments here and there where like I don't even talk to an athlete for like 2 weeks or whatever, and I hear back from him. He's like, I jumped up 2 miles an hour, 3 miles an hour, like something clicked. I'm like, well, I didn't tell you, like I didn't change anything. So what clicked? And he's like, I watched like these 3 videos of yours, and I was just tinkering. Like I was tinkering with it and checking and measuring, and like I know what you heard, what you said here, here, and here, and I put it together, and it finally made sense, and like something clicked. And so it's really cool when they actually are empowered by that information, and then they can go and take that and like almost like become their own coach, really. Because like you said, I'm not going to be there. Their coach isn't going to be there every single day. So being able to actually learn from the information and not just like see a sheet of paper that they're going to just follow some exercises, it's like actually begin to connect the dots. Obviously, it's a double-edged sword where some guys are over analytical and you need to protect them from themselves a little bit. And so knowing which athlete you're dealing with and knowing like, which guy you need to protect from himself a little bit, and then which guys like, hey, he can handle this information. It's going to help him connect the dots a little better.
Exactly. And then when in doubt, just yell throw strikes from the dugout.
There you go.
All right, Ben, this has been awesome. We may have to do part 2. I know you've got a couple more questions. I also know
we could go on all day, so got to cut it somewhere.
Yeah. So, if you guys want to do one more, and then we'd love to have you back, I'm sure, and do some more stuff. So one more, Ben, what do you got?
Do you guys want to ask me a question, or do you want me to go into? We can go into ground reaction force. We can go into grip strength.
Yeah, let's go ground reaction force because we're on the topic of what you're looking at as far as the lower body.
Yep. Okay, so my question here, obviously, you can take this in multiple directions. I talked to Greg Rose a little bit about this, and he's done some research on this as well. But there's obviously a vertical ground reaction force component. I'm specifically thinking about the lead leg, but we can talk about the back leg as well. There's a vertical ground reaction force component. There's obviously that anterior to posterior component as well. But there's also a torsional or torque component as well. Could you touch on that piece? Because a lot of people don't understand that, and I wasn't familiar that could even be measured until recently. But one thing I'm thinking of immediately is like as 2 examples that kind of demonstrate how relevant that force is. One, if anyone's ever like thrown or warmed up like wearing their socks and not just like tossing a ball or doing plyos like in their socks, what you'll see is that like as your lead foot plants, and you plant, the sock actually gets like torqued underneath your foot as this torsion force happens. Like the sock gets like pulled around your foot, and after like 10 throws, your sock is on sideways. Like that's one cool example, just showing this force in action. The other piece to that, the other piece that I noticed, this was a few years ago, I sprained my lead ankle really badly, like terrible lead ankle sprain. What I realized is my foot had this tendency after that point to want to roll out on me because I had lost this eversion strength. So as I began to rotate into my front foot, it would just like cave out on me because I had lost this ability to evert, to hold that big toe down and resist that torsional force, because I still had that ankle sprain. I still had weakness on the lateral side. So I started to realize like how important being able to not just kind of deal with that vertical force, not just deal with that posterior force, but also the torsional piece of it. Is there anything you can speak to on that end and kind of shed some light on that? That's just something I'm very curious about.
Oh yeah. Sorry, I don't have my video on, guys, because I got weird internet right now. What you're talking about is called the free moment, and not many people measure it. Okay, so they're looking at forces that are superior, inferior, so z-axis, anterior, posterior, like what you're saying is front and back, and then medial, lateral, which are really important. And they're all affected by different ankle movements. So you got like your vertical is obviously, you're looking at 2 things. You're looking at your plantar flexion. So plantar flexion is that, basically that one. And your medial, lateral are really inversion, eversion. But your free moment is all related to internal and external rotation of the foot. Okay. And there's not many studies that have looked at it. And the ankle in the picture is something that's so important to look at. And we're so focused because of our weight room concepts of improving dorsiflexion. But the important pieces are the off axis, like what you're talking about, the inversion and eversion, also the internal and external rotation of the foot. And the internal and external rotation of the foot, it happens from the rotation of the tibia. So what you're talking about, we need to create friction. Friction is what allows us to create this rotational force component. And so when you look at the dry foot should be able to plantar flex, externally rotate. That means your tibias are rotating internally. Your foot's rotating out. That gives a kind of the closed chain mechanism. And then it has to actually invert. And you're kind of saying this about trying to keep heel contact. You need to be able to, your shin has to fall to the ground while your foot is gripping. So naturally that closed chain motion is going to be inversion. And the combination of those three movements, okay, external rotation of the foot, plantar flexion, inversion, happening all three planes, it creates torsion that you need. And that's the effectiveness of applying force, the right force vectors. Now, when you look at, talking about this rotational type of torque that's made from the ground on the lead foot, like just what you're saying, you see sometimes where when a pitcher is rotating, the pelvis is coming around, they're getting into layback, they're accelerating the arm, the knee starts pinching in. You see that sometimes where they're stabilizing, the knee starts going in, it looks like valgus, but that's really eversion of the foot. So what you need to have there is kind of different. You need eversion. You need to have internal rotation of the foot. So that means that the tibia is externally rotating about that foot, and plantar flexion. And that's going to give you all those triplanar forces that create that free moment of rotation. So, we can't think of what the ankle does in isolation of all these three movements. It's got to do all these things together. And ankle training, we had ankle-based programs. And quite honestly, we focus so much more on inversion, eversion than plantar flexion and extension, or plantar flexion and dorsiflexion. And like what you're saying, athletes have to throw in cleats to then get that rotational component, because you'll see too, I had laboratory studies. When you're looking at laboratory studies, sometimes they're in like turf shoes and the toe picks up,
right?
And they heel spin, and you can't create that rotational torque, which I think is very important. And you're touching on an area in baseball biomechanics that I can honestly say very few people know.
For sure. And that's one reason, I believe at least, that a lot of athletes do throw harder in cleats. Typically that some guys will throw the same velo in turfs indoors that they do in cleats, but the athletes when they're indoors, you can see that foot spins out on them. Those guys always get +2 to 3 when they get outside, and it's not an adrenaline or game thing. It's literally just big dirt in cleats.
Yep. It's that combination of those 3 axis types of movement, that you're seeing. So like, this is great. So you see how the shin's turning down?
Yeah.
That foot's inverting on the drive side.
This foot's inverting because the shin's now over here, and this still has to stay down.
Yes. Yep. And then what's happening too is that shin's going down. It's starting to internally rotate. So there's that external rotation of the foot because the shin's internally rotating. So it's now
going this way.
Yeah.
The foot is now going.
The foot's basically creating, that torsion, right?
And then there's the reversal of that right here. That now the foot goes into eversion at the last second. It's holding inversion, and then the last second, and then everything spirals up.
Yeah, exactly. And it's just interesting because both feet have a little bit different force applications. That lead foot, when it lands, it's trying to evert. You're trying to get to your big toe. And
the force of that rotation is trying to pull this foot, rip that foot off the ground. And
you're trying to keep the toe down.
Hold that toe down as you rotate into it aggressively.
Yeah.
And that's what I would feel when I sprained my ankle. Like, it was 6 to 8 weeks before I felt like I could trust that again.
Yeah.
Because I had lost eversion strength. I'd lost that ability to hold the toe down as I rotated into the block.
Yes. And it's just so interesting. I mean, baseball, we're just so focused. We're just so focused on mechanics that happen after foot contact. And we need, like, we're talking about this entire podcast about things that are happening before foot contact. And these are like low hanging fruits to improve. No weighted balls, no special implements, just training, mobility, focused on these structures, matching the approach to the anatomical components of the athlete, but these are, you hit this like something that's really interested me on looking at this rotational moment of force, because I did not measure it in my studies, but I have looked at the ankle in pretty big detail. That I think when people start understanding that as a force component, there could be a lot of magic happening, because there's a whole bunch of different ankle mechanisms that go into that. But we can see it. This video is great. We can see all these things happening.
One thing I want to touch on there real quick is, everything that's being described just like any aspect of the pitching, is at some point it's going to be moving in frontal, sagittal, and transverse. But too much when it comes to training, rehabilitation, or even just coaching at any point is you get too dialed in on just looking at one plane of movement, when in reality it's got to be a mix of all three of those at some point. Because when we're just going through what that back foot's doing, even the front foot, is it's going from one plane to the other in a rapid movement when it comes down to it. And if we're only focusing on, inversion and eversion of the foot, we're missing out on those torsions that you're talking about. And there's different ways we need to train everything. And, too often we're only going to train, Mike Boyle is the guy's name, right? Who started going single leg and then progressive overloading and changing from only doing regular two legs on the ground deadlift to now you're doing a single leg deadlift. And, I think he has a good way of looking at things. You're trying to build that stability in those different ranges and different, implements, however it is you can get it done, to make sure that when you're doing an act of throwing that's not so cut and dry, like a sprint, a 90-foot sprint is a little more cut and dry than just what's happening with the back foot during the pitching motion into foot strike. So I think that's important to note too, that it's happening on multiple planes.
For sure. And just to, I know we got to go at some point here, but just to tie this back into, like you said, there's a lot going on, multiple planes. We've talked about eversion, inversion. We've talked about dorsiflexion, plantar flexion. Like this is all things that we can check head to toe. Like these are all things that any coach can learn how to assess these things, right? We can assess tibial rotation. We can assess tibial IR, ER. We can assess ankle inversion, eversion, plantar flexion, dorsiflexion. And we can do that joint by joint through the entire body. So we can see what the athlete's dealing with and see at a glance, like these are probably going to be some limiting factors that show up in the pitching delivery. So we can look at it from that perspective. We just go back to just sample assessment. So like this is actually a former first rounder. He's been in the big leagues, but like we can check actually joint by joint what's going on, grade that, and look at it from that perspective. But then we can also look at it from the perspective, how does he move on the mound? There's a ton of stuff that we look at here and kind of grade them on. And you can go in either direction. So maybe you find that, this is a guy where his hips open up early, or he has a really short stride. Well, you might be able to predict just from that what some of his mobility limitations or his strength limitations might be. But on the flip side, maybe we see from his assessment, like, okay, he's really weak on one leg. Okay, he's limited in dorsiflexion, he's limited in eversion. Like we might be able to also predict the other direction, what mechanical issues there are going to be. So we just have a lot more information at this point at our fingertips. And then you're kind of like this puppet master, again, looking at it from that bird's eye view. How do these things all interrelate? What's a mobility issue? What's a strength issue? What's a stability issue? Like what's a motor pattern issue? What's a nutrition recovery issue? And then you start to synthesize it all. And like the athlete only needs to see the tip of the iceberg. He needs to know, like, what do I do tomorrow to get better? But you as the coach, you have all this information at your fingertips.
I like the fact that, I think too, the assessment should have the pitcher both, if you have them inside, you should try to have them in cleats too. You should try to have the video in cleats, because you will see different mechanisms. Like the lead leg block will be different. I believe nobody's really done the comparative analysis of laboratory or bullpen assessment versus game, but Jordan and I, like I was saying, Jordan, kudos to him, 20,000 data points of in-game data, hand digitized data by one person, which I believe in. There are differences that you're going to see that you might not see, having the athlete in shoes. So I'm glad we're talking about this, because if the athlete can get you some game footage, you'll be able to see some of these subtle differences and maybe understand that maybe what I'm not seeing in my assessment inside the walls of the facility. You might be able to start to match it up with what you're seeing in the game and have even deeper concepts of performance.
For sure. And to take that a step further, one extreme of that, so the athlete obviously needs to be able to trust that lead leg block, right? That's what you're getting at. Like if they can't trust their back leg drive or their back leg force application, back foot into the ground, If they can't trust that, their stride's going to shorten. They're going to stay very vertical. They're not really going to get into their lower half. And if they can't trust their lead leg block, well, they're going to soften their lead leg. They're not going to stride as far. They're not going to get as horizontal of a force application on that lead leg either. If you take that to an extreme and you have someone like throw in socks where they're really slipping all over the place, or have them throw like on a mound, but like in mud, you'll see that really exaggerated effect where they just like don't really use their lower half because they don't trust the back leg to be able to create a horizontal force, and they don't trust the front leg to be able to create that force. So they just kind of throw like very upright, like no lower half. So like I like to use like this example, like athletes that use anterior to posterior, like Trevor Bauer would be a good example. Like he really gets into his backside. So he really creates that horizontal angle on the back leg. And then his lead leg is then mirroring that. Then his lead leg really creates a horizontal angle to mirror that force. Somebody who's like very upright, like they basically don't get into their back leg at all. The lead leg mirrors that as well. Mm-hmm. And so you have to be able to see game footage, but you also want to see what happens in like indoors. You want to see like, hey, maybe that's where the disconnect happens. Because you have both data points, you can see that, and then you can recommend they throw in cleats. So it's all like the point is that it's all, and us as coaches, we need to be able to see as much information as possible and distill that down to the most simple, actionable advice for the athlete.
Awesome. Listen, this was great. Definitely would think we could do this again. Anyone who's out there listening, if this triggered some questions, please, ask us on YouTube, go out to our blog, ask us there, or even just support at armcare.com, email and ask us, and we'll get you answers. I'm going to link to a lot of stuff in the show notes here. This is definitely one you're going to want to watch the YouTube video. But Ben, Brewster, thank you for joining us. And until next time, take care, everyone.